Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Landcare Farming Program webinar. For new listeners joining us today, the Landcare Farming Program is a joint project between the National Landcare Network and Landcare Australia. Our core objectives of the project is to drive awareness and adoption of the latest agricultural research and demonstrate and promote the exceptional stewardship of Australian farmers. To this end, we've actually created a national set of practice, themes and principles to ensure producers are on the right track, and also to make sure we can align the right tools, research, support and knowledge to help producers improve their triple bottom line sustainability. Now, over the next 12 months, we're going to run a series of these webinars, including topics that align to the 6 Landcare themes. The themes that we've got are based around actions on farm that create healthy soil, clean, safe water, and improved biodiversity on farm. And these include vegetation management, ground cover, biodiversity, carbon flows, drought resilience, and people in business. The strength to keep people active in the other 5 principles. All of these together provide a map and on-farm evidence of our sustainability and stewardship, which is an excellent segue into today's webinar, where we're going to talk to 3 industry leaders about their roles in the Australian beef and sheep sustainability framework. And before I get into and introduce today's guests, I'd like to firstly offer acknowledgement of country. As a spoken recognition and commitment to the recognition, and especially today as we gather from all around Australia to talk about landscape health, community resilience and its long-term sustainability, today I offer acknowledgement of country. So wherever you've joined us today, I'd like everyone to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where you're sitting today. Today I'm speaking from Gubbi Gubbi country in southeast Queensland. I recognise the traditional owners, their continuing connection to the land, its water and culture. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and thank you for this opportunity. Now, as I mentioned, we've got a great lineup today. 3 industry leaders who have got years of experience in their individual industries and also working towards a common goal of creating a national sheep and beef sustainability framework for Australian producers. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Bruce Allworth. Bruce is currently a Professor of Livestock System and Director at the Fred Morley Centre at Charles Sturt University in Wagga. Now, Bruce has completed a veterinary degree with honours at Sydney University and has also worked at Massey University and Melbourne University before operating his own sheep and cattle consultancy practice for 25 years. Bruce has also completed his PhD in foot rot as a Fellow of the Australian College. Bruce has got a keen interest in on-farm disease management, production and sustainable practices. Bruce also operates his own sheep and cattle property in southern New South Wales. The second speaker today is Tess Herbert, the Chair of the Australian Beef Sustainability Steering Group. Tess and her husband own and operate 2 feedlots in New South Wales with a combined of 12,000 plus head cattle, as well as a mixed farming operation. Tess sits on the Central Tablelands Local Land Service Board, former President of the Australia Feedlotters Association, and also Director of the Red Meat Advisory Council. The final presenter is Phil Tickle, a co-founder and managing director of Cibo Labs. Phil's got over 30 years experience in the application of geospatial remote sensing technologies in agricultural and natural resource management. Phil and the team at Cibo Labs is on a mission to bring a completely new approach to monitoring Australian grazing lands to underpin more profitable farms and sustainable landscapes. In just 3 years, Cibo Labs have established a fully commercial services delivering estimated pasture biomass and ground cover over 45 million hectares. And that's delivered on a weekly basis. So an amazing set of credentials for these speakers. Kind of makes me feel at my age of under-delivering with all that sort of stuff. But a really great lineup today. Today we're going to have the opportunity to talk to these guys and hear what they're doing to help Australian farmers meet the sustainability targets and what it means for farmers, our customers, consumers and our critics. Now, before we get cracking, just a little bit of housekeeping. Each of these three speakers today are going to provide a snapshot of their roles in the framework, and they'll also have the opportunity at the end to have questions come in. And so in the webinar, this is giving you a front seat executive level access to industry leaders in the sustainability areas. So we'd love to see your comments and your questions. So if you're looking at the webinar through Landcarer, all you need to do to submit a question or a comment or a query is to type it in the text box beneath the webinar screen. Now, if you have any technical issues or you're not signed into Landcarer, the opportunity to provide input is by sending an email to hithere@landcarer.com.au. So hithere@landcarer.com.au. So that's the starting point. We're going to hand over right now to our first speaker. Let's get cracking.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the introduction, Mick. And also thank you for having me along to talk about the beef framework. I'm Tess Herbert, and I chair the Sustainability Steering Group for the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. So currently in lockdown, like a lot of the country, I'm in regional New South Wales. But I also know that in the grand scheme of things, our industry's been able to remain in a really fortunate position. And when I think about that position, I think we can all agree that the past year has been unparalleled in how difficult it's been and the challenges that the industry has faced. In the next slide, I'll go through some of those challenges. We've faced export bans, labour shortages, droughts, floods, fires, human disasters, including obviously a global pandemic. But as always, it shows the resilience and the strength of the industry. And in order to tackle challenges like these and demonstrate this resilience, we need to be equipped and empowered to take on anything that comes our way. We've been hearing over the last few years that through times of doubt and uncertainty, trust is more essential than ever for business and industry to survive and thrive. And more research is demonstrating just that. Our next slide will just examine some of that research. Over the past year, the Beef Framework has engaged Dr. Brad Witt from the University of Queensland. One of his research projects showed how environmental values influence trust and beliefs about societal oversight of the Australian cattle industry. The results revealed that society's perceptions of the industry's environmental performance strongly predict trust in the industry. Dr. Witt states that we need to accept that there will always be a range of environmental values and perceptions from our stakeholders. However, being responsive can be more than just changing our practices. It's about engaging and communicating with industry and between industry and its customers. This goes hand in hand with the conclusion that effective industry governance over environmental performance is critical to building trust. This is what our framework is about, building trust through transparency. We need to be able to say to our stakeholders, we're listening, but also that we've got this. Dr. Witt further produced a report into our framework itself, with positive feedback on our extensive consultation, but also some lessons where both the framework and industry can do better. If we could just move to the next slide. Throughout the framework process, transparency is one of our core values. We're providing an open and honest picture of our performance using the most appropriate data we have available. In our next slide, we examine some of MLA's latest consumer sentiment research. So 53% of consumers research believe that cattle farmers are ethical and trustworthy. 56% believe that cattle farmers care about the environment. 50% believe beef is environmentally sustainable. Only 48% believe that the beef industry is doing all we can to reduce our impact on the environment. While these percentages remain steady over time, they're still low, and they require industry leadership to increase the trust and beliefs, and at times to challenge the narrative about our industry. Industry is doing the hard work, but we also need to band together to showcase how fantastic, healthy and sustainable our product is. In our next slide, we go into the vision of the framework. We have a vision of a thriving Australian beef industry that strives to continuously improve the well-being of people, animals and the environment. On our next slide, we've also defined sustainability. We want to tell our customers that our beef is produced in a manner that's socially, environmentally and economically responsible by caring for the natural resources, people in the community and the health and welfare of our animals. I wanted to show you over the next 2 slides, 2 videos. Both these videos involve one of the members of our Beef Sustainability Framework Steering Group, Melanie Leather. If we could just start the first video. And I'll just check whether the sound is coming through on those videos. All right, thank you. And I'll move on to our next slide. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that the sound was actually showing through on those videos. I'll just give you some background. Melanie Leather and her family operate beef cattle operations. They have an organic operation in Queensland near Banana, and they also have other properties. Melanie is heavily involved in sustainable production and in a number of markets, including their organic market. Melanie's committed their properties, and there are a number of them, to sustainable practices, including extensive Leucaena plantations. And she has one of the visions that she has is for the next generation, her children, to be involved in her properties as well. I'll go back to the framework itself. Why do we do this work? We do the work to meet consumer and community expectations. So we're getting lots of questions in the beef industry, and these started a number of years ago. This framework discussion about this started as far back as 2014. It's also to examine and at times respond to requests to industry to explain our views on the environment and welfare in particular. And these topics are now entering into trade negotiations. But customers just aren't investigating and asking. Many are demanding evidence, and these requests are becoming embedded in supply. This is another form of market access, and arguably this is driving the agenda more. For companies looking to access capital, it's becoming unusual not to be asked to demonstrate just beyond the economic. Their customers want to know the long-term approach to managing the land-based and to mitigating any risks associated with ethical issues. Of course, it's to build trust with all stakeholders and ultimately with consumers, and ideally it's to minimise regulation by industry taking a proactive approach. Our framework has matured over time, and it should continue to do so. Sustainability metrics and frameworks are emerging in most commodity groups in Australian agriculture. They're gaining in strength and position. The beef framework followed hot on the heels of the dairy framework, and I know that the sheep framework is further entrenching itself in the work that it's doing. There are numerous commodity frameworks, sustainability frameworks in Australian agriculture, and there are also global roundtables for sustainable beef. Both the federal government and the National Farmers Federation are supportive and exploring the growth and potential alignment of this sustainability work. And alignment is of real value to everyone in agriculture in measuring and identifying the work that we all do. Just got a note, and unfortunately, because we couldn't hear the narration on the videos, you will be able to see the videos on Landcarer for people to watch after the presentation, and that's really worthwhile. We have another Queensland beef producer on another video later on. If we move on to the next slide. This is what our framework looks like in overview. So the framework has 4 themes: animal welfare, economic resilience, environmental stewardship, and people in the community. Under each of these themes sit 10 topics with 23 priorities, and 6 of these have been identified and pulled out for focus, and these are highlighted. I'd encourage you to download the report from our website, Sustainable Australian Beef, and if you download the report, you'll also see for each priority area, there are indicators. We have about 50 indicators all up. And these indicators are what we report against to provide updates on the industry's performance right across the supply chain. One of the pieces of work we did this year is in the next slide, and it's called a materiality assessment. The initial framework was developed in 2017, and since then the world has moved on. So the Framework Steering Group undertook a piece of work called a materiality assessment that was just to ask our stakeholders, both within industry and external, what they believed was important to them and whether that had changed. Materiality assessment will assist the industry by informing our strategy development, helping to focus our action and our resources, to build cross-functional cooperation between parts of the supply chain and industry. It lays a foundation for discussion with stakeholders about what's important to them and what they also see on the horizon. It does influence our progress reporting, and it identifies those emerging topics. As part of this materiality assessment and the work that we do, we focus heavily on stakeholder engagement, and that's in our next slide. So what was done in that materiality review? We consulted with a number of stakeholders, including internal and external, and the slide here shows you the process that we went through for the materiality assessment. The materiality review report is also available on our website for anyone who is interested in that. Our next slide shows the matrix itself that was a result of that materiality assessment. For the rest of the presentation, I'll be concentrating quite a lot on our environmental indicators, and you can see that through the materiality review shown in this matrix, that environmental indicators and animal welfare indicators were what came out as being very material and what, to some extent, industry could have some impact over. This matrix shows you how we came to identify the most material topics based on that engagement process and that interview process. So I'll focus on the environmental stewardship theme, and in this matrix, they're the ones circled in red. And all of these are highly influential on stakeholder decision-making. Most material for the industry is our greenhouse gas emissions and obviously our carbon capture. My next slide has another video in it, which we might skip. But again, you'll be able to see this on Landcarer, and it's another beef farming couple, Jacinta and Adam Coffey from Queensland. Looking more closely at some of the indicators in our annual update, these are particularly concentrating on our environmental pillar. In our annual update, we launched that at Beef Australia in May this year. And the environmental indicators in here often create quite a lot of media attention and attention from our external stakeholders in particular. The beef industry is a major land steward in Australia, so we share a close and important relationship with the environment. And if you do get a chance to see those videos, you can see that coming through in those. And the beef industry, in order to operate in that environment, we need to prosper by maintaining a thriving ecosystem and healthy soil, healthy vegetation, water and air. So we're ideally positioned to contribute to the ecological health of the Australian landscape by implementing sustainable land management and grazing practices. The Australian beef industry and our producers are committing to fulfilling their role as environmental stewards while nurturing their surrounding ecosystems to foster productivity. The framework also highlights how industry is adapting to the changing environment. These priorities will differ slightly from some that came through in the materiality assessment because we're still in the process of updating our priorities based on that materiality review. On the next slide, we'll go into detail into some of these environmental indicators. One of the priorities was to improve land management practice. Indicator 5.1 in our report was to minimise nutrient and sediment loss. And unfortunately, we've been unable to source credible data regarding soil health and water quality that represents the industry on a national scale because we're a national measurement and we're trying to collect national data. If we can't collect national data, we rely heavily on case studies of local producers doing things in their region. We are, however, in talks with NRM Regions Australia on how we may be able to collate some of the work that they and Landcare groups are doing in this space. On our next slide is one of our reasonably new indicators, improving land management practice through the balance of tree and grass cover. And you'll hear later in the presentations from Phil Tickle from Cibo Labs, because Phil actually helped devise these indicators for us. We appointed an expert working group and who came up with these indicators, but also the measurement for these relied heavily on the work of Cibo Labs. Indicator 5.2a shows the percentage of land set aside for conservation. Sorry, we can have conversations as well. The source for this was the Australian Bureau of Statistics Ag Commodities Survey. The second indicator is also the percentage of cattle producing land set aside for environmental outcomes through active management. We used an internal industry survey for that, but again, we're hoping over time to produce a more robust data set than a beef producer survey. So the industry's been working closely with key customer stakeholders and technical experts in this area, including through the framework process. So this expert working group was convened to specifically develop practical evidence-based measures for this priority. The framework reported against these measures for the first time in 2019, and we've done so again in the updates since then. So we've been able to now see some trends over time. Our next slide shows another indicator representing the national forest and woodland gain and loss from 2018 to 2019 across grazing properties. Again, this is our balance of tree and grass cover indicators. So to put this in perspective, the net change in national woody, which is forest and woodland cover extent, was minus 0.29%. At this stage, without some regionality and context, these figures are difficult to interpret, but again, I'd encourage you to go to our annual update report for case studies on this. So it's difficult to determine whether these figures represent an improvement or decline for this priority. The framework is continually investigating how healthy vegetation levels for each region can be represented in this national indicator. So really there's no trend currently available. So you can see that straight black line in these indicators. Our next slide shows some new indicators on percentage of regions achieving healthy ground cover thresholds. And this data comes from the 31 NRM regions. But you can see obviously in our messaging, and when we give context on the indicators on the side there, that drought was a significant contributor to the data here. And again, we're looking at getting this data from Cibo Labs and the work that they're doing. Our next slide moves on to priority 6, which was managing climate change risk, and priority 6.1 in particular. So the cattle industry has been able to sequester carbon to reduce our net CO2 emissions and to draw down atmospheric carbon. The practice increases soil organic carbon levels and improves on-farm productivity. Currently, there's no agreed method to measure carbon sequestration nationally across the industry, and we're continuing to work on investigating possible options. Our next slide looks at one of our indicators that is heavily scrutinised, particularly by our external stakeholders. The carbon neutral target was set by the red meat industry some time ago, and the red meat industry was a leader in this space. You can see from the indicator that over time we've had a reduction from the Paris baseline year of 2005 in our carbon emissions. There's been a revision of the data from the previous year, but you can see that there's the trends over time say that there's flat and no change. But if you look from the trends from that Paris baseline year, you can see a reduction in emissions. Our next slide looks at an indicator 6.2. Again, this data we are getting our data from our producer survey. And 6.2, that indicator looks at managing and mitigating climate change. And it's the producer confidence in having the information, tools and technology resources. There's a downward setback in that trend, and in my mind, that's due to some of the complexity of the information and the speed at which this space is moving. On our next slide, we're looking at our climate change adaptation and preparedness. We're looking at two indicators which look at the litres of water used per kilogram of live weight for raising cattle, and also the kilolitres of water used per hot standard carcass weight. I've only got one more slide to show you on our environmental, and I'll move on to that one. And this one is about minimising waste. Waste was as a result of our materiality review, waste was one of the outliers that came through quite strongly, that people are seeing, our stakeholders are seeing as increasingly material. The source for this was an MLA project, but it's solid waste to landfill from processing. And I'll finish up with just some comments on what we are looking forward to doing in the future. So my final two slides. Based on that materiality review, what our future environmental priorities from a framework perspective are: obviously greenhouse gas emissions and carbon capture, biodiversity, soil health, forest, woodlands and grasslands, water, ground cover and waste. MLA are currently undertaking a project to discover what data and information exists in order to show how industry is performing in addressing these priorities. We're calling that an indicator refresh process, and we can only do that after we've completed the materiality assessment and review process. But that process is just beginning, and it's an exciting new stage for our framework in looking at what our indicators might look like. We also need, in assessing what our data looks like and how robust it is, to tap into networks like Landcare and get feedback from you as to what this data and these indicators could look like. Thank you very much for your time today. My final slide, I'd encourage you to go to our website and download our annual update. It is quite long, it's 50 or 60 pages. If you're not up to that, there's a shorter version which just gives you really the indicators. But if you want to dive deeper into what the work that we're doing, we have a number of case studies and a number of backstories about producers, processors, live exporters, feedlotters who are doing really interesting work in the sustainability space. Thank you again for your time today.
All right, thank you very much, Tess. It's just amazing when you see how much is going on behind the industry. You go past farms every day on the drive, but the amount of work that's going on in the background. So while we get the next speaker up and ready to roll with their presentation, the videos that we tried to run there, they're up on the Landcarer website under Landcare Farming. Now, both Adam and Jacinta Coffey, Mel and Ray Leather, Stuart and Trish from the Wilmot station, and the Holidays, the videos are up and talking about what they're doing. Now, a couple of those producers are in the Landcare Farming program at the moment doing their carbon or their natural capital benchmarks. So there's a really good segue in that space. So Tess, thanks very much for that. And our next presenter today is Bruce. Bruce.
Yes.
Allworth.
Hi there. Hi, Mick.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Yep, and welcome. That was a great presentation, Tess. It's always a pleasure to follow Tess because for what I'm going to talk about, she set the groundwork so well for us. I'm going to talk about the Australian Sheep Sustainability Framework, and we have hopefully jumped off the shoulders of the beef framework, which is our older and more experienced cousin. And you'll see a lot of similarity here, but it isn't just a matter of changing sheep for beef. There are some other slightly different changes that I'll emphasise. I also note, Tess, that you're going to run in politics for conversation for conservation. I'll have to try and get that right next time. Alrighty, so I'm going to talk this afternoon about the Australian Sheep Sustainability Framework, and if we can go on to the next slide. I just want to just give you a background to what a sustainability framework is. Most people, particularly in the Landcare movement, are probably going to understand that a framework is something around the environmental sustainability practices. But as Tess has pointed out, in these frameworks, certainly the animal ones, we have 4 themes, and one of them obviously is around the environment. One is around the people. One of them is around our animals. So in sheep, we have caring for our sheep. And the 4th one is around financial resilience. So these frameworks are established around material issues of sustainability, not just environmental sustainability for the industry. They operate at a global or national and possibly company level if a company's doing a sustainability framework. In this case, we're working at the national industry level, and we're representing both wool and sheep meat. So it's the whole of the sheep industry. It's not one sector of them. And the framework was initiated by Wool Producers Australia and Sheep Producers Australia. But importantly, the framework does not operate at the farm level. It operates at the national level. And you'll see why that's important as we cover some of our challenges. It relies heavily on individual farm data, but it doesn't impact at the farm level because that data needs to be combined at the highest level, which is obviously at the national level. Thanks, Alexi. The next slide. So in terms of the process that we went through to develop the Sheep Sustainability Framework, once Sheep Producers Australia and Wool Producers Australia agreed that we needed a framework, we undertook a materiality review, similar, well, actually identical to what Tess was just describing. And we also importantly looked at the United Nations Sustainability Development Goal alignment, which is very important when you're working in the sustainability area. We then undertook a process mainly over 2020 of industry and external consultation. And that was probably the most enthusing part of the whole process, was the level and engagement we got in our consultation, despite or with the help of COVID-19 lockdowns possibly. We got a lot of uptake in our consultation, which really helped us to be confident in the issues that we identified in our framework. We then took all that consultation on board over several stages, and we finalised the framework and rechecked with that consultation process our materiality review. And you will note I've highlighted there that the highest things that came out for the sheep industry were around animal welfare issues, and the environment was solidly in the middle of the area. We launched the framework on the 21st of April, and I was going to show you a video on our launch, but given the way the video just worked then, we'll get it up to you at some point. It's available on the web, but I won't be showing it now. We're now at the point where the framework has been launched. There are some metrics around the framework, and it's available for stakeholders to use, and importantly for stakeholders to engage in. And that will be the main process over the next 12 months, as well as getting our first full report out in the middle of next year. Thanks, Alexi. So as with any framework, we've got a vision on about the sustainability of the industry and how we see it. And we've defined sustainability, and that's around the responsible manner that we carry out our business, identical, not identical in wording, but identical to the beef one in intent. And we obviously have principles, and as Tess pointed out, transparency is what these frameworks are all about, and credibility and robustness are really important, and I'll stress that again shortly. We do struggle a little bit in the sheep industry with our framework boundary, given that we include wool. The vast majority of wool, well over 90% of our wool, is actually processed overseas. But for the beginning of the framework, we have restricted our sustainability reporting to only being about what happens in Australia. So all of the overseas processing, which is mostly with wool, isn't currently included in our sustainability priorities, but we're hoping to expand on that over time. It's just that we feel it's critical that we get accurate and robust data, and we didn't think we could do that. We're struggling to do that with Australian data at the moment. We didn't think the overseas data would necessarily be at the same credibility at this stage, so we didn't want to downgrade or risk our credibility at this early stage. And I've got some alignment there. We've gone through a very formal process. This isn't about looking on the back of the cornflakes packet and saying, oh yeah, it says zero hunger, we must be helping. This was a very formal process to say that we are very closely aligned with 4 of the SDGs, and there are a further 6 of them that we're partially aligned with. Thanks, Alexi. So just in terms of why have we got a sheep sustainability framework and what are the aims? And as Tess mentioned, it's those 2 words. It's about building up trust and transparency. And one of our steering group members explained to me that trust is very much like a bank account. And if you can build up credit in your trust account and something goes wrong, it means there's a drawdown on it when something bad happens, but you're not in deficit and people are still dealing with you. And so that's what this is about. It's about getting the conversation out there and getting people to increase trust. And I'm sure those figures the test showed, around 50% of people pretty comfortable where producers are. We'd like to see that a lot higher. So the framework is about providing robust data on material issues, so those issues that are important to both the industry and our external stakeholders. And clearly, from an industry perspective, we want to showcase our sustainability, but it is a two-edged sword. It will, by providing that robust data, potentially, almost certainly, highlight areas for improvement. I'd like to suggest that our industry is perfect, but I would suggest that every industry has room for improvement, and the sheep industry is no different. So we hope that the framework will provide a conversation about areas for improvement, as well as showing our sustainability credentials. Importantly, the sheep sustainability framework is not policy or target setting. That is the role for the industry leaders. The role of the framework is to report on those important issues where targets have been set, but not to set the targets. And it doesn't specifically involve any costs on individual producers, other than probably participating in maybe one extra survey that will go out. So the most important thing in my red circle there is gone haywire across the ether, but it's the role of the framework is to monitor, measure and report industry performance against identified, was what I'd circled, sustainability priorities. So it's not every priority that you have or I have, it's the combination of important priorities that our stakeholders combined agreed would be important. It was quite a decision as to whether we'd report 20 metrics or 60 metrics or 600 metrics. We've settled around 60 metrics. Obviously, that's not inclusive enough for some people, but we don't want to just burden people with too much information. So we're reporting on 21 priorities, 41 performance indicator and 60 metrics. Thanks, Alexi. I just want to give you an overview, and I've sort of mentioned this. At the moment, we've reported with our launch 33 of the 60 metrics. We have these 4 themes: caring for our animal, enhancing the environment and climate, looking after our people, our customers and community, and ensuring a financially resilient industry. And the framework is available on the website. I'll show you a link shortly. I'm just going to concentrate now mostly around the environment, because I think that's where the audience is most interested in, but that doesn't mean that all the themes aren't important, and we have covered all of those. Thanks, Alexi. I'm just going to give you an example here, and this isn't on the environment, but this is our very first metric of how it all works, so that we have identified as a focus area animal care and handling, and then we move from that focus area into a priority, and that the very first priority is, in this case, reduce, refine and replace painful husbandry practices. And then under that priority, there are a number of indicators, one around mulesing and one about the use of pain relief. And for mulesing, we're reporting 2 metrics, and for pain management, we're reporting 2 metrics. So that's how it works, from going from a focus area to a priority, down to the indicator level, and then the actual metrics. Every indicator has at least 1 metric. Quite a few of them have several metrics. So that's why we end up with quite a few metrics, because not always does one metric or one data point show what's going on in such an important area. And anyone who wants to look at this in more detail can have a look at sheepsustainabilityframework.com.au. Thanks, Alexi. And that's giving the full ones, but I think I'll move past that one. If we can move on to the next one now, I'll just have a look at the environmental ones, which I think might be more of interest. And there's a couple of things to note on the environmental priorities that we've got. And that is that we've got quite a few of these where at this stage we haven't been able to provide the data. And Phil's going to talk shortly about the effort and their work on getting some of this important data. It's our approach in the sheep framework has been, even if we think the data is hard to get or even doesn't exist at the moment, at this very early stage, we want to highlight that if it's seen as important by our stakeholders, and if it's so important, shouldn't we be going out and getting the data? So that's an issue I'm going to raise shortly. But we are going to engage expert groups, just as the beef has, to try and cover some of this data. So we've got indicators around protecting soil resource, conservation practices, responsible chemical stewardship, plant pest management, efficient water use in processing, and minimise waste in processing. The fractional vegetation cover for sheep farming is really important. Interestingly, tree cover and land clearing, as far as a sheep industry issue, isn't quite the issue it is in the broader cattle industry. So we won't be going into as much detail. The real difficulty we have is, particularly in southern Australia, is a large percentage of properties run sheep and beef. And to separate out that is going to be quite difficult, and to say what's associated with sheep and what's associated with beef. And we can't just use the beef, because that includes Northern Australia. And so we've got a fair bit of work to actually articulate the data to the sheep industry. Obviously, it would be better if we just had a farming sustainability, but then surprise, surprise, the beef industry don't want to be involved with something that mentions the word mulesing. And so we all have our different little areas. So at this stage, we're still working across individual industry frameworks, but it does mean getting the data is quite a challenge. So I'm happy to answer any questions on that, but I'm just putting that up to highlight the sort of areas where we are trying to report data. Thanks, Alexi. There's one more on this table. Look, biodiversity is probably the most interesting one. I would say in our consultation, when we started talking at that priority said maintain biodiversity, it became very clear that our external stakeholders are not interested in maintaining biodiversity. They're interested in increasing biodiversity. And whilst there are a number of great projects going on, which we can include in case histories, there's no measure accepted yet on what is biodiversity. We've had numerous expert groups come to us, and no one at this point can tell us what would be a good measure of whether the biodiversity across sheep farms is decreasing, being maintained or increasing. We've obviously got the greenhouse gases, and they're reported very similar to as Tess explained in the beef feedlot. We have included emissions intensity there. Personally, I don't think that's acceptable on an international basis, but it's what we're looking at nationally, so we're happy to report that. And we've used a life cycle analysis to justify some of those, but again, that's going to need to look over time as to what the world is really wanting. And we see our use of renewable energy being an important thing that we need to report. So, Alexi, I'll go on to the next one just to bring on to some issues and winding up. What I'm touching on there, and this is particularly across the environmental theme, is getting accurate national data. And that remains our challenge. And as I said, we really wanted to include, even if we thought it was hard, the metrics that we want to measure, or at least the indicators we want measured at this early stage, and see if we can. We can use examples that people are doing to help the environment, but we can only use them as case studies. We can't use them unless it is nationally, unless we're able to pull that across nationally. So if a group in Victoria or a group in Western Australia are doing something, and it might be a fantastic initiative, if we can't show how that relates across the whole of the industry, we can't use that in our metric. And so that's quite a challenge. And the challenge to identify what's related to sheep farming activities as opposed to general farming activities or cattle farming or cropping is also quite a challenge in the environment area. Obviously, in the animal caring area, it's very simple to get that sort of data. So I just wanted to highlight that. I often get after these presentations people saying, oh, we've got this really great project, which we're always interested to hear about, but we need to see how it works across nationally. And the other thing I want to comment on is if our stakeholders have told us that something's really important and we're not measuring it, are we ignoring what's important? Why aren't we measuring it? So that's just out there as a bit of a challenge. There will also be the challenge of the framework, keeping the framework relevant. What we've produced on the 21st of April 2021 hopefully will be quite different to what we need to be reporting in 2026. So there is a process in place to continually upgrade, but equally we don't want to change for the sake of change. And the most value you get out of this, and you see it when you look at the beef sustainability framework, is looking over trends over 3 to 5 years on the same metric. So there'll be a bit of tension there in keeping metrics so we can see the trend, plus updating for the newest things that are available. Thanks, Alexi. I think I'm almost at the end. So specifically for producers, the framework doesn't, I see my pictures from Holbrook have turned upside down. That must be because we're in southern Australia there. Apologies for those pictures. We want to, the framework exists and can show what welfare, best practice and environmental sustainability looks like and is important for the sheep industry. So it's a really good source of information, and it will highlight the areas that we think are going to be important going forward and showing the industry priorities. There are no specific actions that producers need to take in terms of the framework, other than to be aware that it exists and to use it for their benefit. But importantly, it does not in any way impact or prevent on individual producers using their own sustainability branding or initiatives. And there's a lot of that happening now, and I would be strongly encouraging it. And I want to stress that the framework in no way replaces or even assists in that process, which is very important for your individual business. So from an individual business point of view, your relationships with your customers and consumers and your branding with your sustainability initiatives on your own, in your own business, are still very important. And this framework is standing well above those activities. So don't think that that is going to alter what you're doing. So the role of the framework, as I've said, is to monitor, measure and report industry performance against our identified sustainability priorities. And I think, Alexi, that might be it if there are any questions. There's our sustainability, sheep sustainability framework.com.au has got the full report on there. Thanks, Mick.
All right, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, Bruce. Now, I take your discussion about the beef industry not wanting to align with mulesing. Whilst the next speaker is getting ready, there was two questions that have come up. The first one was the areas chosen, particularly around in the metrics around animal welfare. Are they influenced heavily by mulesing issues at all? So I think you sort of spoke to that a little bit.
So the priority is to reduce, refine and replace painful husbandry practices. And at the moment, the most important one identified by our stakeholders, particularly those external stakeholders, was around mulesing and around land marking. So it's around mulesing that we're reporting specifically on the activity of mulesing, and for pain relief, we're reporting on both mulesing and on land marking, pain relief at land marking. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is not good information because there's some confusion when producers filled in the surveys around what pain relief at land marking was. So whilst there has been some information reported on various websites, we don't believe that's robust enough to represent what the industry is doing around pain relief at land marking. So we deliberately did not report that, but we're intending to give a robust answer to what level of pain relief is occurring at mulesing and also at land marking, which are often occur together but are two separate things from a stakeholder perspective.
Okay, excellent. Now the other question, and I guess this ties in with a lot of this stuff we're doing at the moment, and Simon Winfield's asked us, what sort of reception are we getting from luxury goods manufacturers such as Timberland and some of the fashion labels? Are they picking up on using this? I think you alluded to the fact that building their own, but is this being considered by those luxury brands at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hesitate to really name brands because I'm going to forget one and say the wrong thing here, but we've had really good engagement from those brands in this process in terms of driving what they see as priorities. And unless we engage our customers in this, it's a bit of navel gazing in my view. So we need to be aware of what they're doing. One manufacturer, was quite clear that they weren't going to use mules wool after July 2023, so it didn't really matter whether it was in there, but it was obviously important to them that we were moving quickly, and so they were interested in that. We have had good engagement, but we will need to continue to have good engagement. And I've been fortunate to see the Beef Sustainability Consultative Committee in practice, and that's where this engagement all comes, getting these people together every 6 months to discuss what they think of the framework and how they're using it. And the other sector, interestingly, that really need this is the financial sector to engage with us, banks and everything else. They have to fill in a sustainability credential on their annual report. And having this sort of thing at the national level says their investments in sheep properties means that they can tick off on the sustainability as part of their annual report. So it's amazing how these things get used.
All right, excellent answer. Okay, I think we've got the next speaker up. Thanks very much for that, Bruce. Our next speaker this afternoon and our final speaker for this sustainability framework discussion is Phil Tickle. Phil's going to speak about the spatial analysis that's driving a lot of this assessment. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Mick. And we're running a little behind time. Have we got a hard stop, or have I got a few extra minutes?
No, mate, for you, we'll just go until the cows come home.
Okay. All right. Look, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here today. And we're certainly, as a ag tech company, feeling quite privileged to be involved with the beef sustainability framework and now the sheep sustainability framework. And over the last couple of years, we've put together what we believe to be a world-leading and sort of framework for reporting across a range of indicators. I'd encourage you to go to the resources page on the balance of tree and grass cover area of the beef sustainability framework, and we'll also be bringing the sheep sustainability framework metrics in here as well. On that dashboard, you'll see two forms of information. On the there's a standalone dynamic dashboard showing you statistics, and Tess mentioned, I suppose, in the last report there wasn't sort of trend information reported in the hard copy report, if you like. It's really important, I suppose, to look at this reporting as a I suppose, a dynamic, evolving sort of process. And what we're seeing here with this dashboard is a live dashboard with live information in it, using the best available and most current information. And we do have 30 years of trend data for tree cover and tree cover change. The other thing we've done, which is quite different to the way these sorts of national reporting systems have been done before, if you think of the various state of the environment reports that are being done, you get state level statistics or national level statistics. And when you want to actually start drilling that down into things that are relevant to you at a regional level, whether it be an NRM region or a Landcare group, or in fact an individual property, you actually you find yourself running against a brick wall pretty quickly. What we've done is actually set up a process where we've got data that drills down to every single land parcel in Australia. So what you're looking at here, while we're generating national statistics, the data are actually recorded at individual land parcel level for the whole of Australia. And if you look at the that slide there, we've got 1.3 million individual land parcels and 485 million hectares currently being reported against, based on our information around the extent of the cattle industry. And what I want to do here is just to dive into some examples of that. So when you go into the dashboard, you'll see basically the ability to look at ground cover and tree cover over time. What we're looking at there is basically the 3 months from basically March 2021 in terms of the ground cover levels that are basically sort of currently in play in Australia. Importantly, the data that's being used behind this is data that's been rigorously developed through a whole range of Australian and federal government programs. So the Joint Remote Sensing Research Program, we're basing our analyses on methods that they've developed over the last 20 years. And for the woody vegetation cover, we're actually using the National Greenhouse Accounting data and then value adding that in a whole range of ways, which is what I'm going to show you. So let's just dive in. I thought I'd show you northern New South Wales here. You can see the border there. That's the ground cover levels basically in the 3 months past March. Basically, that's effectively the autumn of 2021. So it's not looking too bad. And you can see the basically the areas in fallow and under cultivation basically in the planting periods basically there in the autumn of this year. Very, very different scene if we go back here, and we can now look at basically the autumn of 2020, and you can see here that landscape wasn't looking as good as it is now. I can just toggle between those two. And let's go back another year and look at the horror of basically the autumn of 2019. So this data here gives you basically the ability to zoom into your region and basically a time slider to then look at the last 30 years of ground cover on a seasonal basis for every region in Australia. I'm just going to dive in a little bit further. That's basically autumn 2018. So I just click back there. You can see here the variability that we can see here across those years going backwards. Now we've also importantly brought in a range of other layers that allow us to report in a whole variety of ways. So all of those lines on the map there, that's actually showing you basically the NRM regions, the IBRA regions, the local government boundaries. We've even got postcodes, NRM boundaries, the whole lot in there. So every single land parcel in Australia is attributed in terms of the local government area, the catchment area, or whatever that actually occurs in, and that allows us to aggregate the data from an individual parcel level on the fly to produce this information for tabular reporting and trend reporting. Now tree cover, same sort of thing here. We're looking at tree cover change. Basically, you're looking at the landscape in northern New South Wales in the early 1990s. We've developed a change matrix here, so we track every pixel through time from 1990, and you can see basically in the early 90s, the red areas are basically areas that had change or had vegetation removal in that period. The dark green areas are the primary forest basically, and the light green areas are the woodland. Now we can then look at that landscape in 2019. You can see there's some fundamental differences there. The blue is actually areas of woody vegetation that weren't there in 1990. So we've actually seen a net increase. Now, Tess was talking about trends. There's your trend. There's been a net increase in woody vegetation cover across this landscape since 1990. Now I'm just going to dive into Bruce's home area here. we've got Wagga in the middle of the screen there. That's that landscape in the early 90s, and then we look at the landscape basically here in 2019. So the blue areas, there's obviously a lot of plantations in this area. So most of those blue areas will be plantations. But if you look at that agricultural landscape, we've actually got basically a lot of revegetation, basically roadsides and tree shelter belts and those sort of things. So that will actually come into the statistics that I'll show you in a minute. Similarly, with ground cover, you can look at the ground cover in 2021, in the autumn of 2021. I'm going back to summer 2020, and then look at summer 19. So obviously the Monero is having a pretty rough time basically in the summer of 2019 relative to previous years. So what we can then do, we've now got this dynamic data. We've got all of those regionalizations in there, and then within the dashboard, we can basically report on those. So what I've just done here now, you can do this yourself. The dashboard is live and dynamic. I've just gone into the southeast New South Wales NRM region. I've gone into New South Wales, and then there's your trends of woody vegetation change over time along the national trends. So you can compare the national trends to the regional trends. Importantly, ground cover, we can do the same thing. So what I've done here is just gone to that same area, basically that area around southeast New South Wales. But and you can see here we're reporting basically against the various NRM targets. So we've got the green line is basically the 80% target. The orange line is the 70% target, and the blue line there is the 50% target. We've also got rainfall data in there as well. So what you're seeing there is, generally speaking, across that southeast region, the majority of people are achieving the 50% target, but there was clearly a downward trend in ground cover basically during the drought period, which is not surprising. But we can drill in further. So what I'm going to do now is then look at within that southeast region. I'm just going to look at the southwestern slopes, which is pretty much the sort of the Holbrook area that Bruce has come from, and you can see here the regional trend there, basically, and then you compare that to the trend of the southwest slopes is very, very different. And again, we can see there the proportion of properties that are achieving the target. So in this case here, with a 70% target, in the summer of 2019, we basically had less than 60% of the area achieving a 70% target of ground cover, and a declining trend over time. So we can also benchmark that against rainfall data. So we've basically created a framework here where you can go in and you can look at the region, you can look at the local government area, you can look at the IBRA regions. If you want to know what the ground cover is for a postcode or an LGA, you can do that too, and you can do it dynamically. And you can see here the statistics basically on the top there. We've got the trend lines, and then we've also got the tabular statistics being reported as well. Just a couple more, Mick. Now, when we start looking at these trends, it's really important to unpack them. So, does a single number of ground cover for the country, is that meaningful? I would suggest it's actually not. It's not until you actually look at that ground cover relative to the region and relative to rainfall that it becomes an interpretable and usable metric. So what we've done here, I've just drilled down a little bit further, and now we can look at that ground cover. So the first one is basically the proportion of the area that's achieving a target. And then the second one here we're looking at is looking at the percentiles in terms of the area of ground cover. So you can see here that basically the green line is the 10th percentile. So you can see here there's actually a significant area. So the area below that line is effectively the 10th percentile. So you can see here during those drier periods we basically had 90% of that area achieving less than 60% ground cover. So there's a whole range of ways that we can slice and dice this data. Now, when it comes to an individual property level, we've provided a pathway there as well. So we've got a commercial application where you can dive in called the My Farm Key app. And if you want to look at your individual property level, you can come into the My Farm Key, select your land parcels, and then look at the time series data, and then also benchmark your property relative to the neighbours in the district. So this is a really good example, and I'll finish here, Mick. This is a really good example here. We're using this sort of benchmarking for carbon projects, for a whole range of sustainability projects. The top right-hand graph is looking at the median ground cover of an individual property, and then the orange bars are the 25th to 75th percentile of ground cover of the neighbouring properties. And you can see the blue line is actually going from near the bottom of the pack through to basically they're now actually, while the neighbours' ground cover is going down, they're trending basically on another sort of gradient, and clearly they're changing the land management practices. And this particular case, this is a young couple basically doing effectively regenerative grazing and rotational grazing, and they've basically gone from the bottom 25% in terms of ground cover levels relative to their neighbours, which basically allows us to normalise for rainfall effects. And they're now in the top 25%. So, this couple here can go to their bank and ask for a lower interest rate, and they can probably ask for more money when they go to sell the property as well. So we've basically created a pathway from the national level right down to an individual farm to be able to benchmark the same data seamlessly from the paddock to the national level. I might leave it there, Nick.
Oh, all right, mate. Yeah, you did a great job there. That was a lot of information. For those who are listening in today who've been doing the Landcare Farming Benchmarking Project, I'll probably remember using the farm key to sort of aggregate some of the information. Well, that's a really powerful set of data for demonstrating stewardship, and the opportunity to tie that into things that we're doing every day, not only for demonstrating our stewardship and our social license, but also for the profitability of our business. I think it's a really strong tool. I think there's so many applications for it. We've got one question that just come in there a moment ago, Phil, and it's do banks use this kind of evaluation data when they're assessing climate or business risk?
I think I've had.
Or is it somewhere coming?
I think I've had conversations with 3 banks in the last week. Yes, they're very, very keen to basically to start using this sort of information for basically working with their client base to basically de-risk the loan book, and also work with their individual clients to manage their individual loans. Absolutely.
Excellent answer. Well, I got to say, I'd be very worried if the bank knew that much about my lifestyle. So anyway, well, thanks very much, Phil. That's been a great wrap up, and to all speakers. Now, we've just run a little bit over time, so if you've got any more questions or you want to know more about what's going on in these spaces, we'll put the presentations up on Landcarer. If you've got more questions, the opportunity to put those questions in there, and we'll get the guys who presented today to answer and drill down into them. Also, if you've got any interest in some of the actual products, I can set you directly in touch with those people by the details that they've got in their slideshows. Now, so thank you very much, guys. Very, very good presentation today. From my perspective as the Landcare Farming Program Manager, it's fabulous to see that those themes and principles of both those sustainability frameworks tie in so well with the Landcare Farming principles. I think that's a fabulous segue, and the fact that they're both drilling down at a grassroots farmer level from case studies and building and understand to report up to an international level. I think that's a powerful way of demonstrating what we're doing, and backing that sort of data, that information, the data you're creating there. I think it tells a good story about the stuff that we're doing, whether we're funded or not, or whether it actually shines a light on good practice. And I think that's a great way to go forward, and an excellent way to showcase the work that you do on farm and how it builds soil, water, and biodiversity health. So I think it's a good fit, and I thank you again for your time, Bruce, Tess, Phil, much appreciated. And thank you to everyone who has attended today and listened and asked questions. And also thank you to the Australian Government National Landcare Program for funding the Landcare Farming Program and the associated programs, such as the National Landcare Conference and Awards. Thank you very much, everyone. As I said, this will be on Landcarer later on today. Make sure if you're not on the Landcarer page, sign up and join the Landcare Farming Program. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.